Well, thank you very much. So yes, my name is David Lundy. I'm a senior lecturer here in education. And one of my research interests is civic education and values education. So how we prepare young people to live in society and to exercise agency over the society that they want to become. And so this is where the topic of my presentation today comes from something we've obviously seen again yesterday in Glasgow, climate strikes, school climate strikes. There are lots and lots of ways that schools seek to help young people to understand their values, their roles, their responsibilities, their sense of agency and civic becoming in the curriculum and beyond it, but strikes are not usually one of them. So this is something quite strange, quite new in some ways, the idea of young people actually leading the way in relation to the climate. And I want to think about this in terms of the politics and the ethics of child-led climate strikes or child-led movements in general. We've seen other child-led movements in schools recently as well in relation to Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, and ways that young people are increasingly taking the lead in showing, us older folk what they want their values of the future to actually look like. But I want to just trouble that for a second and think about the notion of education, political and civic education. What is it that we're supposed to do? What are our duties as educators of the next generation? So I want to frame this in terms of, first of all, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So to frame this in terms of possibly a sort of conflict between two different parts of this rights framework. So Article 28 provides that every child has a right to an education. And this is quite a strange right in a lot of ways, because we have lots of rights. We have rights to freedom of speech, we have rights to freedom of assembly, but there's no one forcing us to do those things, right? The right to an education also places a duty on a child to go to school, basically. And it places a duty on parents and the wider society to provide those school places. So normally speaking, we wouldn't see strike action as something that sort of fits within that. But Article 12 also provides that every child has the right to express their views, feelings, and wishes in matters affecting them, and to have their views considered and taken seriously. And what we see with the climate strikes, obviously, is children, young people, saying that the schooling that they are being provided with does not prepare them for the society that they are able to engage in. It prepares them for, on the one hand, it prepares them for a world of work within a system that is already damaging the planet and unsustainably for their own future. And it doesn't prepare them with the skills that they will need either to change that system or to live in the aftermath of what that system creates. And so that creates a sort of a bit of a dilemma for a rights-based approach to education. What are we supposed to make of the notion of school strikes? Children, there isn't ordinarily a right to strike for children from their Article 28 duties, if you like. That's not something that normally exists in law. And I want to go into some of the philosophical kind of underpinnings of this. And I want to begin with a note of caution from the past. So this is the infamous scene from Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1950s. There had been, this was post the decision in Brown versus Board of Education that US public schools had to desegregate. The governor of Arkansas had said, I'm not going to enforce that ruling. And President Eisenhower had basically called his bluff and called in the National Guard to escort these 4 young African-American students into what had previously been a segregated all-white school. And in some ways, it's it seems like kind of a moment of triumph, that the law has been enforced as it was supposed to. But the philosopher Hannah Arendt sounded a note of caution about this in her reflections on Little Rock, where she said, well, the most startling part of the whole business was that the federal decision to start integration in, of all places, the public schools, that she sees this as burdening children, black and white, with the working out of a problem which adults for generations have confessed themselves unable to solve. And I think it raises a really important question about this Little Rock incident. What happens once those school doors are shut and the National Guard are still on the outside? That by abolishing the authority of adults implicitly denies their responsibility for the world into which they've born their children, and refuses the duty of guiding them into it. And I think Arendt really sees this as being a crisis moment for education. The fact that the children have had to be left at the forefront of moral education rather than being guided into this, because there is no model yet. There is no model of how integration is supposed to work at an adult level in Little Rock, Arkansas at this time. And I think we're at a similar kind of crisis point. We're at a similar crisis point where for a lot of children, they have no model of what a sustainable adult world is supposed to look like. And so I want to kind of look at this as a moral dilemma. What duties does this place on us as educators? So I work within the education team, preparing primary teachers to go out into our schools in Dumfries and Galloway and in the wider world. This is one of the points that I would come back to from this. Comes from a more recent philosopher of education, Amy Gutman, who talks about the idea that sometimes for adults, the claim to know the difference, the claim to be able to morally educate our children is not just a pretension to moral superiority, but a reflection of their greater moral understanding. So sometimes as adults, we really do need to teach our children the values of the future and the values of the values of the past, and leave it to our young people to understand what they're going to make of that in the future. 2 minutes. Okay. So how do we balance out listening to children for the future that they want to create with helping them to understand how we got here in the first place? I'll not talk too much about this, but understanding the right to an education as a political right. Ordinarily, the state and its delegated adult authorities like schools and teachers have a right to enhance what I've called here the normative resources of children, to teach them about what counts as right and wrong. And therefore, ordinarily, there wouldn't be a right to strike from schools. But I want to raise a question here, and I'm following on from the work of Tim Fowler at Bristol University, who's explored this in a presentation as part of a project that I was working on, as to whether the climate strikes are an exception. Is there something exceptional about these climate strikes? If the state's right to educate children is not dependent on the views of the child, it is still dependent on the child's right to an open future. So not being indoctrinated to believe something just because adults believe it. And the education being a genuine moral enhancement, not just the passing on of prejudices or superstitions. And in the case of the climate strikes, young people are precisely making the case that the education system's preparing them with skills that prepare them to contribute to an economic system that they believe to be unjust to people and the planet. And that system is rapidly reducing their right to an open future, closing down that right to an open future. And if that case is well made, then it seems that the right to strike in the sense of a right to strike from school may indeed be well founded. I'll leave it open to questions now. I've been told to finish up. That seems like a good place to end it.
So thank you very much, David.
You're welcome.
Questions for you? I suppose as an employer, what I want to see is students that are motivated, and believe in something, and also I think the one thing that I would say for the students of today is flexible, because everything is going to change every 4 or 5 years during their careers. They're going to have to retrain, relearn, re-engage in what they're doing on such a regular basis. I think this whole point of enabling their minds, making them feel self-confident and giving them those tools to do that are critical. How do you think that fits with that sort of climate strike process?
Well, I think our current generation have had to be incredibly flexible. They've had to be incredibly flexible with everything that COVID has thrown at them. And I think it shows their resilience that they were striking before COVID. They've had lots of months of not being entitled to their time in school, and they're still striking after COVID. I think that shows some resilience. I'm personally quite critical of a lot of the resilience agenda in schools. I think it's pessimistic. I think it involves preparing children to accept a world that is worse than the world that their parents grew up in. I think a lot of the kind of grit and resilience stuff that we see, particularly south of the border in education policy, is really problematic. Going back to the 1940s, when schools were set up in areas where children had been evacuated to during the war, these children were experiencing the most extreme kinds of dislocation and needed resilience, but we didn't go for a curriculum for resilience or a curriculum for defeat. The education initiatives that began then, that ended up in being enshrined in the 1944 Education Act, were called Education for Freedom. There was a recognition that actually we want these children to learn how to build a better world after the war. And I think we need to rediscover some of that hopefulness. How do we teach young people to, yes, be flexible and imaginative, but be imaginative towards what the better future can be, rather than just resilient to whatever the crisis throws at them?
We are a renewable energy employer, so hopefully that will fit.
I hope so. I hope so.
We've got time for just one other question.
Part observation, it's great seeing in the news. I think it was in Wales, I can't remember where, that some students lobby their schools. They teach us about the green agenda, what's happening. And it's great because the school kind of folded and did that training. But generally, what can we do, or what can just raise it? What I mean, how can we build into the curriculum allowances for our children to learn about things that affect them in the future, as you're kind of suggesting in the presentation? How do we build that into it? Because it's very academically focused.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very kind of philosophical, moral sort of framing of this, but it would be a whole other presentation to look at curriculum design. I think we are making progress there. There is a learning for sustainability priority within the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence. I'm not sure how well that translates to SQA at secondary level. I think we're doing some good work at primary level. I think there's an element of the SQA system being a little bit behind that, perhaps a little bit more traditional in some ways. I think I would bring this as an invitation, those of you who are working in renewable energy, who are working in sustainability, to please contribute to the way that the curriculum is designed and the links that we can make to local initiatives. There's a lot of freedom within the Curriculum for Excellence for us to teach about local issues. And obviously in this area, the renewables industry is a big part of that. I think what's tended to happen in the past is that things that already existed, like forest schools and outdoor education, have been reframed as learning for sustainability, just because they're outside and they're kind of in a green space, rather than actually learning about sustainability. So, you know, we need to learn from you as well, you know, if our children are to learn from us. Yes.
Isn't the problem that the children are striking because they have to go extracurricular because schools can't be seen to be political? You know, you're talking American climate deniers, so teachers, we can teach, you know, community activism and wise behaviour, but you know, the schools are not going to challenge the capitalistic society and the inequalities that are the basis of climate change in this country across the globe.
I think a lot of schools actually support the climate strikers. I think a lot of school heads do support the climate strike movement. I think the idea of a strike, though, is designed to be more than just education. I think this is why I'm trying to say is there's something exceptional here, that this is more than just education about climate. What the climate strikes represent is a recognition that what we have called education in industrial capitalist societies is in itself kind of stands structurally in contradiction to some of the climate demands that the climate strikers are making. Yes. Okay.
No, I mean, that's the technique. Thank you very much.
Let's.
I'd like to welcome Dr. Amina Shah to the stage, as it were. Thank you. Amina is a research associate here in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies. Okay.
I can use this one. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Alistair, and hello everyone. Welcome. Alistair already mentioned I'm working as a postdoctoral research associate here in Dumfries campus. I mainly work in natural-based solution for natural hazards and risk reduction. Today I'll talk about how people are adapting to climate change. I think last couple of presentations we have heard about the carbon mitigation and how we can do it, and also David talked about the education system. I'll talk about how people are adapting globally. Recently, we have done one global study led by the University of Leeds. We reviewed basically the literatures or scientific articles for 6-7 years, and identified how people are adapting to different types of climatic hazards. So I'll talk about what type of hazards are driving to take initiative for adapting to the environment, and who are adapting. So different types of groups, social groups, and then what type of responses they are doing. And the last point is it really, working? Are those adaptation measures are helping to reduce risks? So what we have done, as I said, we have done the literature review of scientific literature around 48,000 scientific articles. So for reviewing those huge number of articles, we have applied two approaches. One is the machine learning. So we have used software which can screen all the articles and basically identify it with the different keywords related to human, not the other animals or plants or other things. And then we shortlisted around 1,700 articles, which met our inclusion criteria. Then around the globe, we have 126 experts who have been coding all these different articles to identify all the different points, the different hazards and different types of responses, what we have basically related to human adaptation. And you can see here the global scenario. This is basically showing the number of articles distribution from different regions we have found. Yeah, thanks. So let's look at the different types of climatic hazards which are driving people to adapt with. What we have found that in the literature, most of them are talking about the general climatic impacts, and then drought was another major hazard they are talking about, and then extreme precipitation and inland flooding and precipitation variability. If you see the global distribution of different scientific articles, you can see mostly from North America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And there are some literatures from Oceania and also from South America. So you can also relate to those things like it depends on the scientific study, how people are studying those things. So could be it's a little bit looks biased, but as our methodology is based on scientific literature, so this is the scenario how people are reporting. Then next one is go back. Sorry. This is about the different types of actors. So who are adapting with? We have identified different types of institutions as well as the individuals and households. So who are adapting? And we found that mostly the individual and household level, those adaptation measures are reported in the article. Around 80% articles reported those. And then the next level, we found that the local governments, they are taking many actions. And then national government and the private sector. Private sector engagements are coming like the business and the large enterprises, they are also doing some measures. And again, this similar situation we found mainly in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, they are doing, those things are reported. Then we looked at what types of adaptation actually people are doing. And we categorize into 4 types of things here, like the behavioral or cultural. So this is kind of the autonomous adaptation. The people adapt with the situation, what they experience, and they try to mitigate those things. And other things like the technological infrastructural adaptation. We build the dams or the embankments or the water supply system irrigation facilities. So those kind of things are also there. And natural-based solutions like ecosystem-based adaptation. There are many places where people grow mangrove forest in the coastal area or build their earthen dams. So those kind of things are there. And institutional, mainly institutional adaptation is focusing on like the policy development and funding for adaptation measures, so those kind of things. Then we looked at whether those articles have really reported the actual risk reduction or whether they have evaluated the risk reduction by those adaptation measures. And this is the big kind of still gray area. So most of the articles, they have reported, yes, people are doing adaptation, they are taking adaptation measures, but they haven't really quantified or evaluated properly whether actually the risks of the people has gone down, okay? And it is partly because of the unavailability of the evaluation methods. So we don't have really proper evaluation method. How do you evaluate risk reduction of people? In Africa and in Europe, it could be different. So the methodology is a big challenge still. And another one is difficulty of attributing such outcome to the study's responses. For example, I mean, if you are taking one measure for flood risk reduction, but it can also help to reduce the drought mitigation. But it's sometimes difficult to attribute actually which one is helping for what. So those kind of attribution is still in a gray area. And already I said about the measuring, the avoided impacts of risks. So I think I'm at the end almost, yeah. So this summary of our study is recently been published in Nature Climate Change Journal. And some part of our study is fed into the IPCC report. It's coming next year. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Amigo.
Yeah. Do you have any
Questions for us? Please.
I was really interested to see how, when you had the slide up with the different continents' responses, it seemed like Europe and North America were focusing on technological solutions, and Africa and the global South more on cultural or behavioral change. Is there any indication of whether there's a good, are there better outcomes from behavior, from solutions that use both behavioral and technological change, or is one of these preferable to another according to what you've seen so far?
Yeah, we try to look at in some cases like the comparative study, whether which one is more preferable. So actually, as I have mentioned about the actors, so it depends on the actors. In the Africa or Asian countries, the individual households, they are actually the main initiator for taking the responses. It's because they have less or very minimum support from the government structure. But in European society, it's the other way around. So it's kind of government is supporting more. So our study is from 2013 to 2019. So based on the report, we got this scenario. But I'm sure there will be, there are some studies where they can compare in the same situation, how they are working. Thank you.
Is there a plan to redo your study, say, every 5 years? So you can see how this policy versus the institutional versus natural solutions versus technological solutions starts to change. Because it's, I suppose, it's the evolution of all of this that is the really, really important bit rather than the sort of picture in time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's this global mapping, adaptation mapping initiative. It started from 2019. So this is the first study we have started, and our plan is to continue it to track the adaptation measures over the years. So I hope that every 5 years we'll try to update our findings and we'll share with you all.
Still time for one more question.
I'm just sort of wondering whether it's inclusive of inequality.
Equality.
Inequality, well, it's just that I'm aware that in the UK, gap between the richest and the poorest has been getting wider and wider and wider for the past 30 or 40 years, and it's not been very good. It's been detrimental to everybody's health, not just people at the bottom, but everybody right across the board. And I think that's been happening internationally as well. So I wonder if that has been looked at.
Yeah, when we looked at the articles and mostly found those are, concentrated in Europe, Asia, North America. And that was one of our objectives. Where are the gaps? Where we don't see any reported adaptation measures. Why people are not reporting it. So it's partly because the research project and the scientific research going on different parts. And in terms of inequality you are talking about, we actually tried to, that's why one of the objective was whether there is any evidence of risk reduction and how people are working on that. And it's still gray. We could not find very good study which is showing why those things are different in different areas. So I think that could be a further research we can do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew.
Okay, thank you.
Oh. Yes, I'd like to ask you now, Lori, to is the team leader for the gallery there.
Hello. Can you hear me? Oh, yes, you can all hear me. Anyone online can't deny that. Are you going to click through?
I can. Sure.
Brilliant, cool. Right. The 10-minute presentation is always a bit of a challenge, so I'm going to keep it nice and concise. And if you could please limit any sustained periods of applause or laughter, it'll really eat into the 10 minutes. So we're all in this together, really, if you wouldn't mind. There's 10-minute presentation as well. I was really a couple of points to get across. The most important thing I want to say is what part does heritage have to play in this net zero discussion? We've heard about Dumfries and Glasgow Council having this hyper ambitious net zero carbon region by 2025 target, probably the most ambitious in the UK, if not the world. What part does heritage have to play in this? And I'm going to try and give you as a little snapshot. We are you might think a heritage scheme, but we've woven some net zero activities into it. And I'm hoping it gives us some benefits. So, snappy title, how can our amazing natural and cultural heritage help our region become net zero? My first name's McNabb, my surname's Laurie, which is the most complicated part of the presentation. Brilliant, all goes with us. So I'm not going to tell you how brilliant the Galloway Glen scheme is, although coincidentally it is brilliant, but I will come to that in a moment. We're a 5-year scheme, 2018 to 2023. So we started before that net zero target was set. So we had no idea this net zero target was here. We built our plans of what we were going to do. This is all about connecting people to our heritage. So you see that bottom point, connecting people to our heritage. That's the emphasis, that's the whole aim of the Galloway Glen scheme, but it's how we can actually tie it to boosting the economy and supporting the sustainable communities. I put a wee map up here on the left so you can see the Cuckoo, Castle Douglas, and up into the Glen Kens. For those of you locally, Dumfries over this way, and then Stranraer over that way. So we're one of the 7 river catchments of the UNESCO Biosphere, which was mentioned before, and we're drawing, how do we get this lottery money? With lottery funded scheme, we've got £2.7 million from the lottery. And how did we get the money from the lottery? We said we've got special cultural and natural heritage in the area, and the natural and cultural landscape justifies that investment. So we built the projects all on this culture and heritage. And so how are we actually tying that to net zero? So now I've got a map here of sort of achievements that we've done. Now this is very all about money, the money that we've spent, how many 176 local businesses benefit. This is all money that we spent. footpaths, miles of footpaths, number of online events, how many miles travelled by tagged geese. So this is all about headline activities. This satisfies our funders. This is the providing the economic boost for the area and connecting people to their heritage. But this is the key point of the presentation. The next slide is actually see here, it's the same scheme. What have we done that actually has a net zero or addressing the climate emergency, but also the biodiversity emergency, which I think is absolutely a key part of this. What net zero activities have the Galloway Glen scheme done? So looking in here, I've put in some headlines of more than 12,000 miles travelled by electric vehicle. I'll talk about that in a second. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, not talked about enough, but we're building a local plan around Loch Ken, built on all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Climate Ready Ken project, talking about adaptation. Fascinating to hear a presentation before about adaptation. We focus on mitigation of emissions, but adaptation is absolute core because we've baked in the changes now. Changes are coming to the area. How can we make more resilient communities in the face of those changes? 1,400 hectares of landscape under active management. And then we're working with 3 landscape restoration projects, this amazing idea of harnessing actually natural capital. How do we better value the ecosystem services and activities that are going on? How can we use these on the drive to net zero? 11,000 native trees will be planted across the region by March next year, supporting biosphere's high focus species. Education, it could say children are our future, as the phrase has been used before, but working with the Crichton Carbon Centre, a series of education activities we've done in schools, these are all tying into this. How do we engage better the net zero? And that's the spoiler alert, really, is that I think the heritage, what does heritage bring to the table when we're focusing on net zero? It's an opportunity to engage, ability to engage. Why does doing a place names project, a study of place names in the valley, how does that contribute toward net zero? It all provides engagement channels and opportunities that we can then harness to try and push these net zero related projects. Brilliant. So I've just got a couple of examples of projects in here. Tree planting scheme. This is particularly interesting because we started out a relatively small £10,000 tree planting scheme, and we're doing this for landscape reasons, but also for the carbon capture. And then we've also got the story about it. What does planting a tree, what difference does planting a tree make? So we're trying to do quite a lot of comms about, oh, we planted a tree, that does change the landscape, but that's also the carbon capture benefits that come from it. So we pushed it quite hard, and if you jump on, you can see we've got the red and ignore the red and blue, it means whether they've applied or whether they're just about to apply, but we've got trees going in across the region. We've pushed the communication very hard, and then the next slide is we've then secured more money for more tree planting across Dumfries and Galloway. So there's an interesting thing there about we're established as a heritage scheme, we want to do a bit of tree planting, we do it well, we tell people about it, it actually draws more money in. So to an extent, activity does breed activity in the sector. Boom. We got the car, terrible line split there, but we were able to blag a free car because we said we'd be a rural EV ambassador. And we said that to get the car, but actually the first year that we had this car, everywhere we went, every meeting was preceded by 10 minutes of, oh, this is the car and this is how the car works. And so it's all about embedding these new technologies into a rural area. So I think not only is the miles traveled, it's actually the discussions that we've had about the car and trying to normalize the change to EV vehicles. We did a series of the Galloway Footsteps events, talking about personal impact, what little changes can we make that will change our carbon footprint, individual carbon footprint, and how quickly, if you come together as a team, that can actually aggregate up to making a difference. So we ended up with 36 members on the Team Galloway and changes that they're looking to make. This is an online system. You might have heard of Geeky. The online system allows sort of gamifies basically your carbon footprint. Leave your lid on your pan when you're boiling the water, that saves you this much, and turn lights on. It's just little things that differences you can make. And then there's a question of adaptation. So working with people around Climate Ready Ken for adaptation. All of us remember that overall heading of our scheme, connecting people to our heritage. And you think this is amazing that heritage has opened the door to allow us to do these net zero related projects. And boom, next. And then this is not a plug for the event, although it is still to happen. This is actually in 3 weeks' time. What funny weather we're having. What does it mean and what are we going to do about it in Galloway? So we're really trying, we're not mentioning sustainable development goals, we're not mentioning net zero, we're trying really hard to make this engaging and approachable. And all of this is possible because we've established the mechanism of the scheme to do it. Boom. So this is the key thing, is that the cultural and heritage sectors are useful players in the drive towards sustainable development. And I think sometimes that comes down to the fact that culture and heritage can be a way of engagement and reaching parts of society, perhaps that if you stand up and say net zero, you will only draw the engaged or people open to it. we're quite good at targeting the sort of disinterested middle as probably the group of a lot of people that we work with who are bewildered, but able to, when we get in on the Galway Lens scheme, they can then learn more about the region's net zero target. I think that's it. And I just wanted to end with this. It's quite nice to see the experience that we've had is starting to be recognised through various academias of endorsing this point. Trying to get a better understanding. I think culture was identified as one of the 4 planks of a sustainable community, and it's how heritage and culture can open doors into engagement. So I think it's part of the aim is trying to get that engagement and to get people to get on board with the net zero challenge, and maybe heritage is a way to do that. And summarising here, we got the money because of the cultural and natural heritage assets, but I think our focus on sustainable communities, the real benefit has been had on this idea of engagement, and it's the relationship between the culture and heritage and how that can help the modern day challenges, I think is just starting to be better understood. Boom. Anyone got any questions? Yes, man back there.
Okay. There's no doubt, and it's inevitable, that there is a lot of transformation coming with the transport. I've got some questions about that, but to keep it to the heritage theme, a lot of the houses in Galloway region, if you mind, have a particular look and feel. They are part of the culture and heritage of the area. How does that work with sustainability? It's the biggest, one of the biggest greenhouse carbon emissions that we haven't really dealt with locally is heating our homes. How do we keep the heritage of our homes and still maintain and still achieve that EPC that Jeremy just mentioned earlier? How do we do that? And what's
the only experience we have in that is some of the other, maybe not heating of homes, but some of the other things like transport. We find that by having a focus on a coherent area like Galloway, it ends up having the same challenges. So basically what you're saying is that everyone in Galloway is a general theme of the challenges that people are facing. We haven't really tackled housing yet. Through what we've done, but what I quite like is when we first doing these Galloway Footsteps events, someone said, "Oh, we need to talk about car sharing. You need to talk about park and ride." And we have to say, "Well, in Dumfries and Galloway, these are not options. We have to tailor this for how people actually live in Dumfries and Galloway." So we're able to focus much more on actual Galloway-related solutions. So yeah, no, I agree. There's always going to be a balance, and then you get planning involved or listed buildings, and it does get more complicated. But look, there's a brilliant project in Balmaclellan. The Balmaclellan Smithy has been refurbished from an old smithy, and it's totally, you can heat it basically with a 60-watt light bulb now. It's an absolutely amazing building. It has cost a lot of money to do it, and it has said that it was, yeah.
It's a huge cost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the roles of the Galway Lens scheme is possibly to try and value the heritage as well, so that we don't, in the headline, we don't rush for the cheapest, always the cheapest option. Okay. So is there another question in the man at the back there?
Tourism was mentioned earlier. The impression I'm getting is that the population in increasing Galloway seems to be shrinking in permanent residents and increasing numbers of weekend, week-long visitors, holiday homes. How are they going to be brought into the culture if they're only here for 2 weeks, a year, 4 weeks?
Yeah, good. That's a tough one. We have to be. It's very interesting to look at the demographics, who attends the events and things that we do, because there is a very well represented recent arrival to region sort of people, but that is often people who are staying here. The Climate Ready Ken project is trying to look at adaptation. How do we adapt to weather around Loch Ken? And what I would like is even some very basic things. I would like, if you buy a house around Loch Ken, you have a fact sheet by the door of this road will flood when the weather is bad, or try and get people on board with what's happening, because I think that's the problem. Is you move to the area on a sunny day and you don't realise what it's actually going to be like through the winter. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Certainly. Sorry, yes.
I think this is a silly question, but how you plan to cope the risk of weather with the electric car? Because I think in England there was a few years ago a petrol electric station that closed because of the rain, and for 3 weeks it could not use that petrol station, and some animals died because they tried to drink the water of the flood, and they get electrocuted by the federal station and the electric path.
Yeah, and you're getting into the really interesting question, sort of touched on before, about this idea of adaptation. How do we adapt things? Because the general principle being if the road keeps flooding and washing away, you just put the road back in and then it washes away again. And so what we're trying to do is challenge that a little bit to say, do we need to change how we use that road or where that road is located, or and also when the bad weather comes and school bus, the biggest problem we have is kids getting to school or something like that along the roads. Who knows who to call as backup and who's got a tractor to get people out? So there are some tiny little things that can happen around the edge to make a difference. And I think that's what we're going to try and focus on rather than the broader strategic.
It's time for one more question. I'm sure you think David has your hand up.
I'm just going to come back on the question about the built heritage side of things. And this might be something that one of our previous speakers could come in on as well, is that the issue around insulation. So a lot of the older houses, 30 to 50% of the living space is loft conversions and always has been because of heritage reasons. That's how people use their homes. And it also tends to be some of the more affordable housing as well, some of the housing that people are already experiencing inequality of sort of house as housing options. How do you, I suppose, how do you square that circle in terms of the challenge of insulation and built environment?
No, it's really hard because you see some new developments going in now. Everyone talks about passive houses, the gold standard of things, and I think it's sort of aspiration towards passive house that's coming. But there is a change of lifestyle involved in that. Is that Galloway has always been separate, isolated houses and coming together. And it's a really tough one. It's been quite interesting actually moving back up to Dumfries and Galloway. Living in Manchester, you're judged by the car you have on the drive, whereas in Dumfries and Galloway, you're judged by how much wood you have in your woodshed. It's a sort of different thing, and I feel like there's almost a different interpretation of how to survive. And I think there's an element of we need to draw on the special things of Galloway and try to have a Galloway response to things rather than a sort of more standard thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Brewer to the stage. She has a senior lecturer in design and science and risk here in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies.
Sorry, just having technical issues. I never thought about microphones when I wore a dress. There we go. So hi everybody, my talk today is on a paper that we recently published on the EU's Green Deal for the ambition for the toxic-free environment, filling gaps in science policy making. And this was a project that I started work on before I joined the University of Glasgow. So I joined in May, and we've been working on this for the year before that. And it's in relation to a society that I work with. It's the Society of an Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. I'm the president of Europe at the moment, only for a few more months. And I know I've got to keep saying that president here. And if you're interested in the paper, you could actually grab the scan of it. It'll increase my engagement as well, and that would be fantastic. I'll just leave that on for a moment. And I'm really going to talk you through the research that we did. It all started before the actual chemical strategy, the sustainability came out. And it was really as the Green Deal was initially established in December 2019 that we decided that this would be really interesting. We're all chemists or environmental scientists, and this strategy is for us. We need to be very active in it. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the whole world is full of emissions and chemicals, whether they be natural or man-made chemicals. And they can be a problem in larger quantities, and some of them can be a little bit more harmful than others. But we only really know about the potential risks of the tip of the iceberg. There's so many of them around there. There's only about 100,000 chemicals on the market. And of those, there's only about 500 of them that we really understand the extensive characteristics and hazards of. All of the other ones, we know some things about, but not necessarily everything about. And so there's a lot of work still to be done to fully engage with all of these topics. So when the Green Deal came out, as I mentioned, in December 2019, I just actually gained election. I was going to be president in 2020. And I said, right, we're going to focus on this. This is something that we're going to be sort of really engaged with. We're in Europe, it's a European policy, let's go for it. And so we set things into motion, or should I say I did. And part of that was to get ourselves on the high-level roundtable for the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability with the European Commission. So I applied diligently, it might have been a bit last minute, we got it. So now we're one of 32 organisations on that committee. And so we're regularly engaging now with the European Commission to try and make a difference, to try and make sure that the strategy is implemented correctly. And that strategy really focuses on the three areas that I've highlighted: a zero pollution ambition, toxic-free environment, whatever that actually means, preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, and the farm for fork strategy as well. So those are the bits that I'm going to be focusing on. But the Green Deal in itself is really encompassing everything to try and, by 2050, make sure that Europe is sustainable, that it's having zero emissions being released into the environment. So I want to come back to this word, toxic-free, because this sent all of my colleagues into, oh, what is that? Because can we have anything toxic-free? Is it really a first word to be using on a government document? Lots of people thinking, this is a political statement. This has nothing to do with science. You can't have toxic-free. Other people have said, it's really, really not scientific. We can't engage with this. It's a joke. And so we started to think about actually what could toxic-free mean and how might we be able to engage with it as a scientific community. Because obviously the strategy has been created to engage with the public. Politicians want to be voted in, and so there's a toying with words to try and make it work for everybody. So the first thing we did in May 2020 at our annual meeting, which was virtual, but that's another story, we decided that we would have a discussion forum. So we had like 400 people at the table. But before we actually engaged with the forum, we sent a questionnaire around to all of our members. So we have around about 10,000 members worldwide, but it was specifically people in Europe who were engaging with us, and we had about 230 responses, which was a little disappointing, but it still gave us what we needed. So we asked lots of questions within that, and one of them was, how are we interpreting the word toxic-free? Because as I mentioned, there was a bigger hoo-ha of what it actually meant. So within the questionnaire, we can see that we had academic, we had government, we had business, and we had NGOs taking part in the survey. I should explain that CTAC is a tripartite organisation that encompasses all of those players. And we identified that the majority would say that all chemicals can be admitted into the environment, but in low concentrations, so that potentially no negative effects on organisms occur. So when we had our discussion forum, this then introduced lots of debate, because actually, does it matter if you protect everything? We don't know what all of these organisms are. Some of the deepest ocean organisms we're not even familiar with. Does anything matter? Or is it things that we're more familiar with that we need to be more careful about? Would the general public be more upset, for example, if we lost the polar bear and compared to a little fish that nobody really knows exists? So there's lots of discussion to try and work out actually what it might mean. And later that year, the European Commission did us a favour, because they actually released what they thought this toxic-free environment means within the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, which was released a little bit later than the actual Green Deal. And they say it's where chemicals can be produced and used in a way that maximises their contribution to society, including achieving green and digital transformation, and while avoiding harm to the planet and to the current and future generations. So in truth, our guesswork wasn't far wrong. So we started thinking we were a bit Sherlock Holmes, and we started looking a little bit more closer at the other answers that we had for our survey. And if you want to get the definitions, you can get them on the internet, or you can use my little scan devices as well. So Later on in the processes, so later on this year, in fact, in May 2021, now we've done our initial survey, we found out what everybody thought toxic-free meant. We've then gone back to the policy to identify what the European Commission actually thought it meant. We went back to the original pool of people who completed our survey to say, okay, so you've had the initial one, you've had the real one now that the Commission has released. Do you sort of still agree with our initial survey that we did? And if you recall, our survey said that all chemicals can be emitted, but in low concentrations, so they are not going to cause any negative effects. And what we found was that, yes, even so, even though we had the real definition in place, people felt that the work that we'd done was quite accurate. But we also had quite a few people now potentially disagreeing. And in fact, we had about 38 people of the 100 people that we corresponded with to say, well, actually, that definition perhaps isn't necessarily correct. So they suggested alternatives to that. So they were saying that not necessarily all chemicals can be admitted, only substances that are considered low risk should be considered, definitely not causing any effects, and that it should only be essential use or no chemical release. So I want you to think like what actually you think of as toxic free. So we continued our story in our work on this area, and we really focused on what would a legal framework look like, how can we potentially simplify that, and what comprehensive knowledge might we want to be considering moving forward. And we've got to remember that certainly with regards to chemical risks, how chemicals are assessed in Europe is that they're assessed on a particular type. So we have the chemicals being explored for pesticide use, for pharmaceutical use and industrial use. And they're categorized differently depending on their use. So in some situations, you find that chemicals are banned for some things, but not for other things. And this is a little bit tricky. So there is an identified risk that you might be using things in different situations that you necessarily should be. So there's this idea now that you should have one substance, one assessment. So you have one assessment for each substance, regardless of its use. And this is the way that the processes is going to be moving forward within our Green Deal. We've also identified that we need to have really comprehensive information on the substances that are being used, and this at the moment is missing from the European market, and more work needs to be done with this. We've also lacked that there's a challenge with regards to how chemicals are being used and their volumes, and there's a lack of data on this. The problem is that large companies have scientists working on these problems, and they're not sharing the information readily. So it needs to be much more transparent, and we need to have much more information flowing between people working in these areas. So we've also asked people, actually, do they think that it's achievable to have a non-toxic free environment? And it's really lovely to see that across the board, people sort of agree that it can. Industry is slightly sceptical, as you might expect, but overall, people are agreeing that actually we can do this. So in conclusion, what we really find is that there needs to be interdisciplinary debate. We need to have more data that needs to be very transparent, and it needs to be available on anything. We need to do more work on mixtures, because that's the tricky thing. If you've got so many things mixed together, how do you determine which might be the harmful thing? We also need to look at risk and hazard. So if we think of hazard, it's identifying the dog and going, that's a hazard, keep away. Whereas a risk is going, it's a chihuahua, its bite might be quite small. If it's a bulldog, then perhaps move away. So it's looking at the difference between those things to determine the problem attached to it. We also need to look at exploring the policy, making sure that it's very encompassing, and then again, that it's interdisciplinary explored. And rather than just looking at it on the setting within Europe, it needs to be much broader. Everybody needs to be working on this together, because otherwise it's pointless. So I'd like to thank my co-authors for the paper and the people who helped us with the discussion, and also some experts from Europe who helped. So Professor Colin Moffat, who was Scottish scientific officer for Marine at the time, and Sylvie Lemon, who works for CEFIC. Just to give you a little bit of an update, we're continuing this work and story. We're working on a new paper at the moment that actually explores the obstacles in the way of delivering these things. And we have activities later on this year where we are going to be pushing it further and exploring it from the industry's perspective as well and how they're making products. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much, Michelle. Questions for?
I suppose there's, as you said, there's different mixes of chemicals and everything else, but one of the things is, when you're looking at the risk, is the way in which a chemical or product is used, enters the system, and then as far as commercial use, say for example, lithium-ion batteries, for example, then the way that we upfront manage, because people are using lots of lithium-ion batteries and we're only just starting to talk about how to recycle them. So that recycling element and that end use element, how much did you look at that? Not just the use of the chemical or the product, but the way it's dealt with at the end of its life.
Yes, so I mean, certainly within Europe, these are things that are taken into consideration. So we have life cycle analysis that takes place, and certainly if companies are producing something which is potentially harmful, then they have they need to be able to look at mitigation for breaking it down and putting the environment correct, like with anything. So we didn't specifically look at that. The chemical strategy for sustainability has 15 points that it's looking at, which includes things like how you enforce it, how do you monitor it, how do you actually put the strategy into place. But certainly all companies are it's really the key word is trying to use something that is less harmful in the product in the first place is the key thing. Because if you're using something that's less harmful, then it's going to actually be much easier to put right at the end. And that is part of the strategy.
Yeah. Something that's not harmful in huge quantities.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. And you mentioned the mixture. So if I just put it into context, so obviously one thing on its own is it can be harmful or it cannot. If we take pharmaceuticals, for example, when we ingest a pharmaceutical, it's there for a purpose. We need to take it to make us better or animals better. But as it goes through our body, it breaks down into metabolites, so other substances. And those themselves could be more harmful potentially to the environment than the actual drug itself that you've taken. So mixtures, especially in the freshwater environment, are extremely challenging to deal with because there are so many different things it could be. And this is certainly in the UK recently. I've been involved with looking at how we set up the UK strategy and for chemicals, and it's been highlighted that mixtures are the key driver that we need to explore. So I think the key thing is trying to substitute for the less harmful and trying to make sure that we protect the environment that we best we can. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer it exactly.
Well, as you can tell, my full
Just a quick question. I mean, you said about the one substance, one assessment. So
yeah.
It feels like very simple, but I think it's not.
No, it is not. And it's very challenging because obviously substances are used in different ways. So they can be used on their own, they can be mixed with other things. So this is a whole hurdle that is trying to be established at the moment to identify how it can be done. And there is quite a lot of opposition to it as well, although it does simplify things considerably if we can do that. But it's getting everybody's agreement.
Yeah, just related to that, I'm just wondering because when you do assessment and then the different standards of use, etc., and how often they evaluate it regularly after 10 years or 5 years?
It's a constant thing. So when a company makes a product, for example, they have to go through a whole battery of tests. Sometimes that involves animals as well. The idea, certainly within Europe, that should be the least response, but quite often they have to do that in order to meet the standards, and it costs millions and millions of pounds. Somebody was telling me the other day how much it's at least 10 million for making a product. So it has to be tested, and if it fails one of those things, even at the very end, they can't use it. They've got to go back to the scratch. So there's a huge investment from companies to actually create the products, and that's why they sometimes don't want to necessarily share all of the information, which we really, really need, so that we can do these things like one substance, one assessment, and we can try and do it as effectively and as cheaply as possible.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you to the audience for your questions. I think a round of applause to all of us. I think at least some of them have offered
Thank you very much.
Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. My name is Sarwar. I'm a lecturer in environmental science and sustainability at the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, University of Glasgow. First, I would like to thank all the speakers and all the audience, because for me as an academic, it sounds very an interesting session. It means, in terms of climate change, the actions, the mitigations and adaptations, all the stakeholders, all different types of people from sectors, from education, from academics, from politicians, and now we're trying to solve our future, try to see a roadmap, and that's what we need at this moment. So I'm very happy to invite David to introduction to the school and work taking place in Dumfries and Galway. And I'll just leave you with him to give an introduction to you and then your talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, afternoon everybody, and thank you very much for that welcome. And first of all, I would like to say as well, thank you to the 4 schools who are taking part this afternoon to showcase some of their work. We know that schools are very pressured and very busy places at the minute, particularly in terms of COVID and that recovery phase. So thank you very much to the staff and the young people for taking part this afternoon. What I would say is the work that they are sharing today, we've also asked schools to share as part of an international conference which is coming to Scotland in a few weeks' time. We work closely with Learning for Sustainability Scotland, who are one of the regional centres of excellence for sustainability. And they are about to host in Scotland the 12th International Global Conference of their network. And we've been asked to showcase the work from Dumfries and Galway and from our schools at that event. So that postcard, that electronic postcard was completed yesterday, and the schools certainly, I think, were all shared that yesterday. So please share that amongst the staff, amongst the young people and amongst your parents, because it's a great opportunity to be involved not only in a local conference here in Dumfries and Galway, but also that international conference as well, and really to put Dumfries and Galway on the map. So my name is David Maxwell. I'm an education officer within what we call the Curriculum and School Improvement Team, which means about half of my role is working on quality improvement with schools, and the other half of my role is working on curriculum aspects. And in terms of curriculum, I have responsibility for maths and numeracy, STEM, so science, technology, engineering and maths, and learning for sustainability. Thank you. And it was moving on perfectly earlier, but it just doesn't seem to be moving on perfectly anymore. So we'll keep going while somebody tries to sort that one out. So within the context of education, we would talk about learning for sustainability. Learning for sustainability is not a curricular area in its own right. It really is one of our cross-cutting themes, and we would want, and the aspiration in our schools is that all of our children and young people from 2 all the way to 18 are learning about and embedding those principles of sustainability. I was able to join some of the meetings, some of the events this morning, heard lots about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's why certainly I'm encouraging folks to wear the pin, to wear the badge, to think about Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll talk about that more as we go forward. We heard about social justice, about climate justice, about resilience, about community engagement, about people activism, and those very much are all our aspirations in terms of where we want to be around learning for sustainability. Thank you. This Wordle, we share a lot with our schools. This is produced by Education Scotland a few years ago, where staff were asked to think, actually, what does learning for sustainability mean? So you'll see there on there lots of things engaging with democracy, human rights, children and learners as leaders. So learning for sustainability encompasses all of these things. But probably importantly, and that's why it's involved in the centre, it's about learning for a better world. How do our children and young people grasp what's happening out there, think about the world, make their own decisions, make those decisions that are socially just, that are responsible, that are well informed? How do they navigate through the social media channels? How do they navigate through fake news? How do they make sure that the decisions that they are well informed to make the decisions that they want to make? And again, linking back to this morning, making decisions for themselves, for their local community, and therefore for Scotland and the world. So learning for sustainability really is all about learning for a better world, and that's why we've chosen these 4 schools to come along and talk to you today, because each of those 4 schools demonstrate how they are encouraging their children and young people very much to learn for a better world, but also to think about activism and think about actually doing something about it. So learning about it is the first stage, but then how do we move further than just learning about it to actually doing something and doing something productive and active about it. So thank you. Of course, because we're a local government, we very much have to look at local government, and we have to look at Scottish policy. There are a number of documents. This document here, Learning for Sustainability, the One Planet Schools report, is actually 10 years old. The start of COP in Education Scotland were keen to say that they have been producing this document and working on this work for around 10 years. So this is our starting point in terms of schools and the education system, and it still is a very relevant and very worthwhile document to read. Lots of really good key messages in that document. A couple of years ago, Vision 2030 was produced, and these 2 documents together inform our action plan for taking sustainability forward in schools. Just prior to COVID, this 3rd document, which was produced, which is the 2030 action plan, taking this document and turning it into actions that as a local authority, that as a Scottish education system, we need and we want to address. These are a summary of the 5 actions within that action plan. So learning for sustainability becomes an entitlement to all learners. That's all children, all young people in our schools have that entitlement to learn about sustainability and what that means. Every practitioner should reflect LFS in their practice. So whether we are learning assistants, nursery nurses, early years assistants, head teachers, deputies, all our practitioners in Dumfries and Galloway are expected to reflect the principles of LFS in their practice. Have our schools developed robust, coherent systems around the curriculum? What are our school curriculums looking like? What opportunities do our children and young people have to engage in that LFS work in our schools? Thinking about our school grounds and our school buildings, and that's not part of my remit, but thinking very much about how are we adapting our school buildings, how are we thinking about energy costs, are we thinking about insulation, and how are we building more energy efficient, more carbon efficient buildings, and what does that look like? And that's a piece of work that other colleagues within our departments are working on. And do we have that strategic national approach, and my role as a local authority officer, do we have that strategic local authority approach to learning for sustainability? Are we clear with our children, with our staff, with our parents, and with our communities what learning for sustainability looks and feels like in our schools? As you would expect, working with education, there are lots of policies, there are lots of documents, there are lots of things to read, and this is really about making connections. The one in the centre here, teachers are well used to, is Curriculum for Excellence. We talk about this being the Curriculum for Excellence washing machine in terms of what it looks like, but learning for sustainability is very much in there. That's about 20 years old now, that document, but learning for sustainability is very much embedded as an entitlement within Curriculum for Excellence. A couple of years ago, we produced our curriculum narrative, that refresh narrative around Curriculum for Excellence. And any of you that keep up to date with education news on television or in newspapers will know that a number of very strategic documents have been produced lately by the OECD, looking at Scottish education, telling us the good bits, but also highlighting some areas that we need to work on. One of those is about that pathway, that journey that our young people take from primary school into the broad general education and then into the senior phase and to the exam timetable and things as well. So we need to consider our curriculum and our curriculum and our assessment pathways. SQA are working on this. SQA are, as they launch new qualifications, are very much embedding this within their work. And as we see the role of SQA change and adapt over time, there will probably be much more opportunity to embed sustainability and climate change in new qualifications that are coming forward for our children and young people. We are very much aware of the UNCRC about to become into Scottish law. We know there's a little bit of a delay in that, but we know that the principles are there and embedded and agreed, and it is likely to happen at some point. Gregna are here to talk to us very much about the work that they have been doing to embed UNCRC within their own schools. And we know about Sustainable Development Goals and the work that our schools are doing to try and embed those Sustainable Development Goals in their practice. This is our self-evaluation and our inspection framework. And LFS is very much embedded with that as well. So during collaborative reviews, where I would go into school and look at the quality of learning and teaching, we may well be looking at some aspects of sustainability. And when the inspection team will soon in schools after Christmas time in the new year, learning for sustainability will become more part of that inspection process in the time ahead. We also have the General Teaching Council, who have refreshed the standards for teachers. Those standards were refreshed and new standards were published in August 2021. And learning for sustainability is one of the cross-cutting themes within the standards for all teachers. And that's early phase teachers, experienced teachers, teachers in leadership positions, and importantly, newly qualified teachers who are perhaps here on the 4-year course or the postgraduate graduate course. They have to be demonstrating early phase in their practice. So thank you. Our context in terms of Dumfries and Galloway, our elected members declared a climate emergency in June 2019. That climate emergency has produced a climate emergency action plan that all of us that work for the local authority have to deliver. The council have added a 5th priority. Usually we talk about our 4 council priorities. We have a 5th council priority, which is very much about reducing carbon and thinking about the impacts of climate change. So as council employees, and living in Dumfries and Galloway, we very much have to meet the aspirations of this report. Some of that work has been about creating this role of climate emergency officer. The climate emergency officer bridges across all council departments and all council directorates. Actually, we had a meeting with her yesterday, and Sarah's role is very much to make those links and make those connections across the council, so that together in all our directorates we are working on the emergency declaration and 12-point plan. There is a council's climate emergency officers group established, and that meets regularly and again discusses and works on our targets for climate change across the council. And from that, as an education and learning directorate, we then have to make a response to that. So we took our first paper to committee, to the Education and Learning Committee, in March 2020. And that paper we shared with our elected members who sit within our Education and Learning Committee, and we agreed with them that over the next coming years and so we would be delivering these outcomes. So we very much want to raise awareness of LFS amongst all people who are part of education. We very much want to develop an LFS strategy for our schools, to support our schools with that local strategic direction about how we would like to move forward. We have developed a learning for sustainability action plan with key actions for ourselves and for our schools as we move forward. Importantly, we need to give our schools that time and space to share good practice, such events like this and professional learning for staff, encourage that sharing good practice and that sharing of new learning. And we want to celebrate the posters. And again, today, very much celebrate some of the posters and build on some of those posters. Thank you. So what have we done so far? We have created an LFS partnership group. That group is a group that meets 3 or 4 times a year. These are just some of the members of that group, and you'll recognise some of those symbols, some of those badges. We're working closely with Dumfries and Galloway Outdoor Living Learning. We're working closely with the Carbon Centre, but lots of other organisations there as well, many of which you will know, many of which will be working within your local area. But the partnership group is about working together on those different areas, pulling together that resource, pulling together their knowledge and being able to share and deliver that across our schools. So we have a learning for sustainability action plan. We have developed as a team some KPIs, some key performance indicators, things that we would be reporting on. We're looking at the number of children and young people who are gaining John Muir Awards, who are gaining Duke of Edinburgh Awards, who are involved in the Young Philanthropy Initiative. Always have to pause a second before I say that. So the Youth Philanthropy Initiative, we're looking at schools. We're looking at the number of eco schools that we have in Dumfries and Galloway, the number of schools that are going for fair trade schools and fair trade awards. There's a whole gambit of things out there that schools can do, and schools can't each do them all. But together we can learn from each other by choosing different projects and working on different projects. We have sent out a survey of need, 2 surveys of need actually to our staff, one about outdoor learning and confidence levels of our staff in delivering outdoor learning. And the second one, our confidence levels in delivering things like citizenship and sustainable education. And that has given us a clear direction of the way forward in terms of some of the professional learning that we would like to do with our staff, just to upskill staff in some of those areas. And we are developing, as I say, our local authority strategy in line with the Scottish Government strategy. We are developing our local authority strategy, and we hope to have that ready about Easter time, and then take that to Education and Learning Committee in their summer meeting around about June. And then that will very much become a public document, and that will be the aspirations and Dumfries and Galloway for our children and young people. And I'm almost there because I'm aware of time. We developed what we call our CLPL programme. That's our professional learning programme for teachers, and that's a huge programme of professional learning we put on, working with a range of partners. So we're working with Eco Schools, we work with WASDE, which is an organisation that represents us as a local authority, and other local authorities together in terms of some ideas around local citizenship. So we have developed quite an extensive professional learning programme. We launched our first LFS conference for our staff last year. That had over 40 local partners delivering. Those sessions are all recorded and all sit within GLOW, within our schools, and schools and staff are accessing those resources on a regular basis to find out about the work that they can do and projects that they can become involved in with their children and young people. COP has been part of our planning in schools. We produced this document for schools, very much about preparing for COP, but more importantly, embedding the SDGs within practice. COP, in a sense, is a couple of weeks. COP is an event that will come and will go. And actually what we want is the legacy to COP and that legacy element. So for our schools, that legacy element is the Sustainable Development Goals and how our schools embedding those Sustainable Development Goals in the curriculum. So it's not about delivering extra, delivering more. It's if you're delivering a topic in your school on water, are you thinking about joining up some dots and thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals around water? If you're looking at energy, can you think about the Sustainable Development Goals? If you're looking at living things, can you think about the Sustainable Development Goals? So it's not an add-on, it's not an extra, it's not another particular area. It's very much about embedding that work in what we do. And really importantly, this last point, because this is what learning and sustainability is all about, pupil voice, but more importantly, pupil action. Because we want our children and young people to have that voice. We want them to have their say in their school and in their community. But importantly, we want them to be able to feel they can take action on that. So climate strikes, all of that we saw on the news last night in Glasgow is great. But actually, what difference is that making? And what actions are our children and young people taking? So that's great. They can have a day off school, they can march, they can stand up, but how are they living their lives back at school, back at home, that actually make a difference? So it's about taking those, understanding the learning, but then living that in a real true sense so that you have those aspirations and you have that vision for the way forward. The world is complex, the world is difficult. These are just some examples of things that are happening around the world. How do we build those skills of our young people to become data literate, to become numeracy literate, to become politically savvy, to know what's right and wrong, to understand fake news, to understand social justice, climate justice? That for me is what learning for sustainability is all about. How do we equip our young people to have those skills to be able to develop, to be able to live, but to be able to thrive in this very complex world, because none of this is going to go away. Arguably, it's going to become more and more and more complex as we see the results of climate change. So how are our young people going to steer through that? What about their jobs, their employment in terms of these aspects? And I noticed downstairs earlier I was speaking to our DYW colleagues who are thinking about that in terms of those employment opportunities for our children and young people in the future. And just finally, I suppose that political landscape. As I said at the start, my remit is STEM, which sits over here. My remit is also learning for sustainability, that sits here. How do we bring all that together? Now, the government are making attempts at bringing that together through these documents. We know moving forward that green skills, that green jobs are an opportunity for our children and young people. So how do we prepare for that as a local authority? What curriculum offer do we give our children and young people? How are we working with the College Academy offer? How are we working with digital learning? How are we working with e-soil that some of the young people here will know what all those things are? But how are we working with all of these organisations to widen that curriculum offer and make a curriculum offer that prepares our children for living in that world of uncertainty? This is the vision for Scotland. This is what we are all about as teachers. This comes from Scottish Government and the National Improvement Framework. Excellence and equity. But the bit in green there I've highlighted for me is that important bit. The knowledge and the skills. We need children to have the knowledge to make the decisions, but also to have the skills to do something about it. And for me, that's what learning for sustainability is all about. So I'm delighted now, because that is longer than I said on the speak, I'm delighted now to hand over to 4 of our schools who are going to share with you the work that they've been doing on some aspects of learning for sustainability as we put that forward. So first up, to have Sarah.